That morning, nobody knew the age of Vikings had begun with the screams of dying monks. June 8th, 793 AD. 30 Viking longships emerged from the North Sea, mist like demons rising from the depths of hell itself. Their dragon prows cut through English waters with the silence of death approaching. At their head sailed warriors who had never seen Christ's cross, men who worshipped gods of war and thunder, who carried axes that had never tasted Christian blood. But that was about to change forever. Defending Lindisfarne stood the holiest site in northern England, the island monastery, where St. Cuthbert had walked with God, where monks had copied sacred manuscripts for 2 centuries, where pilgrims came from across Europe to touch relics that could work miracles. The brothers who tended this sacred flame had never imagined that evil could sail across waters blessed by saints, never dreamed that their prayers would be answered, not with salvation, but with slaughter that would echo through Christian nightmares for generations. But the Vikings had been watching Lindisfarne for months, studying its defenses, learning its routines, counting its treasures. What the monks saw as divine protection, northern eyes saw as fatal vulnerability. An island accessible only at low tide, filled with gold and silver accumulated over centuries, defended by men who had sworn never to lift weapons in anger. It wasn't a holy sanctuary. It was the perfect trap for victims who would never fight back. The monastery bells that had called faithful to prayer for 200 years would ring this morning for massacre. The stone walls that had sheltered learning and devotion would run red with the blood of men who had devoted their lives to peace. The sacred ground where saints had walked would be defiled by pagans who cared nothing for Christian sanctity. Everything that made Lindisfarne holy would make its destruction more complete. Abbot Higbald had risen before dawn for matins, as he had every day for 30 years. The old man who had dedicated his life to serving God stood in the chapel where St. Cuthbert's body had once rested. Around him, 42 monks knelt in prayer, their voices rising in Latin hymns that had echoed across these stones since the days when England was young. None of them knew these would be the last prayers many would ever speak. The Viking fleet that approached Lindisfarne represented something entirely new in European warfare. Not armies seeking territorial conquest, not kingdoms fighting for political advantage, but raiders whose only goal was portable wealth and the terror that would make future raids easier. Each ship carried 20 to 30 warriors who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this kind of assault. Men who could land on a hostile beach, overwhelm any resistance, strip a target of everything valuable, and vanish before help could arrive. Brother Aelred was the first to see them. The young monk, responsible for tending the beacon that guided pilgrim ships, stood on the monastery's highest tower. When dragon prows appeared through the morning mist, his scream of alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence like glass breaking in a cathedral. By the time his warning reached the chapel, Viking ships were already grinding against the rocky shore below. The age of Vikings had announced itself with the sound of iron-reinforced keels scraping against Christian stone. What happened next defied every assumption medieval Europe held about warfare and civilization. The Vikings didn't demand surrender or negotiate terms. They didn't seek political submission or religious conversion. They simply began killing, systematically, methodically, with the cold efficiency of men who had turned mass murder into a profession. The monks who tried to flee were cut down in the monastery gardens. Those who knelt in prayer were slaughtered at the altar. Those who hid were dragged from their hiding places and butchered like sheep. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical slaughter. For 800 years, Christianity had spread across Europe with the promise that faith provided protection, that God would shield the righteous from evil, that monasteries were sanctuaries where violence could never penetrate. In one morning, Viking axes shattered those comfortable assumptions like ice breaking in spring flood. If monks could be murdered at their prayers, if sacred ground could be defiled by pagan weapons, if God himself wouldn't protect his most devoted servants, then what safety could anyone claim? Brother Thomas the Illuminator had spent 15 years copying manuscripts in the monastery's scriptorium. His life's work lay scattered across stone floors where Viking boots trampled centuries of learning into bloody mud. The golden letters he had painted with such devotion were torn from vellum pages that became kindling for fires that would consume everything he had lived for. The man who had devoted his existence to preserving Christian knowledge watched it burn in flames, lit by pagans who couldn't even read the words they were destroying. The raid that followed redefined European consciousness about security and civilization. Vikings moved through Lindisfarne with the systematic efficiency of men who had planned every detail. Teams assigned to specific buildings, priorities established for different types of treasure, even escape routes mapped before the first sword was drawn. This wasn't random barbarian fury. This was organized professional warfare, conducted by men who understood exactly what they were doing and why. The monastery treasures that Vikings discovered exceeded their wildest expectations. Silver chalices encrusted with precious stones, golden reliquaries containing saints' bones, illuminated manuscripts bound in covers of ivory and gold, silk vestments worth more than Viking chieftains possessed, bronze bells whose metal alone represented fortunes. Most shocking to Christian minds, these sacred objects were treated as simple plunder, torn from altars, stripped of ornaments, melted down for raw materials without any recognition of their spiritual significance. But the Vikings carried something more devastating than axes and swords. They carried contempt, absolute indifference to everything Christians held most sacred. When Abbot Higbald begged for mercy at the high altar, Viking warriors laughed. When Brother Aelred offered to ransom himself with monastery gold, they killed him anyway for sport. When the youngest monks wept and prayed for divine intervention, their captors mocked the God who had failed to protect his servants. The psychological warfare was as brutal as the physical slaughter. The resistance that Lindisfarne offered revealed how completely unprepared Christian Europe was for Viking warfare. Monks who had taken vows of pacifism faced men who had spent their lives perfecting violence. Brothers who had never held weapons confronted warriors who could split skulls with single axe strokes. Scholars who had devoted themselves to prayer and contemplation died beneath the hands of pagans who worshipped through battle and conquest. Brother Cuthwin made the mistake of trying to save the monastery's most precious relic, the illuminated Gospel of St. John, written in letters of gold on purple vellum, represented centuries of artistic achievement and spiritual devotion. As Viking warriors smashed altars and scattered sacred vessels, Cuthwin grabbed the manuscript and ran toward the sea caves, where he hoped to hide it. The Vikings caught him before he reached the water. They took the golden letters for their intrinsic value and used the purple pages to wipe blood from their weapons. The systematic destruction that followed shocked even contemporary chroniclers, accustomed to medieval warfare's brutality. Every building searched, every stone overturned, every possible hiding place violated. The Vikings weren't just looting, they were making a statement that no place was safe from their reach, that no treasure was beyond their grasp, that the Christian God was powerless to protect even his holiest shrines from northern fury. Young Brother Oswald hid in the monastery's root cellar as Viking boots thundered overhead. Through gaps in the wooden floor, he watched dragon-tattooed legs stride past, heard foreign voices arguing over the division of plunder, smelled smoke as centuries of accumulated learning burned above his head. When he finally emerged 3 days later, he found a transformed world. Not just destroyed buildings and scattered treasures, but the end of everything that had made sense about Christian civilization. The Vikings' treatment of Christian symbols revealed their strategic sophistication. They understood that destroying religious artifacts wasn't just profitable but psychologically devastating. Every smashed crucifix sent a message to Christian Europe. Every burned manuscript announced that pagan gods were stronger than the Christian deity. Every defiled altar proved that Norse weapons were mightier than Christian prayers. This wasn't random vandalism. This was calculated psychological warfare, designed to terrorize an entire civilization. The loading of plunder onto Viking ships proceeded with military precision. Gold and silver, sorted by purity, precious stones removed from religious settings, and evaluated purely for material worth. Even human captives selected based on their potential value in slave markets. The sacred had become secular. The spiritual had been reduced to commercial calculations. Everything that made Lindisfarne holy had been transformed into Viking wealth. The few monks who survived the initial slaughter faced choices that would haunt Christian consciences for generations. Renounce their faith to save their lives. Watch helplessly as pagans defiled everything they held sacred. Some chose martyrdom, dying with prayers on their lips. Others chose survival, living with memories that would poison their remaining years. Brother Wulfstan, who lived 30 more years, never spoke of what he witnessed on Lindisfarne without weeping. The Viking withdrawal was as systematic as their assault had been. Ships loaded with treasure, captives, and evidence of their complete victory departed with the same efficiency they had shown in attack. No lingering to enjoy their triumph. No ceremonial display of conquered symbols. Just professional raiders moving to their next target before any response could be organized. The northern mist that had concealed their approach now concealed their departure, leaving behind only devastation and the smell of death. When King Offa of Mercia received word of Lindisfarne's destruction, he reportedly fell silent for an entire day. The most powerful monarch in Anglo-Saxon England had been helpless to protect Christianity's holiest site. His armies, designed to fight other kingdoms for territorial control, were useless against enemies who struck from the sea and vanished before pursuit could be organized. The political implications were as devastating as the religious ones. The Northumbrian response revealed how completely Viking tactics had outmaneuvered European military thinking. King Athelred's forces arrived at Lindisfarne 4 days after the raiders had departed. They found smoking ruins, scattered bodies, and evidence of the most systematic destruction anyone had witnessed. But the Vikings were already 200 miles away, planning their next target. Traditional warfare meant nothing against enemies who treated the sea like a highway, and every coastline like a potential battlefield. The chroniclers, who recorded Lindisfarne's destruction, struggled to find language adequate to describe what had happened. The Northumbrian Chronicle called it the beginning of sorrows. The Irish Annals termed it the first wound inflicted by pagans. Later writers would identify June 8, 793 AD, as the day the Viking Age began. But all agreed on one thing: the world had changed. The comfortable assumptions that had governed European life for centuries lay as shattered as Lindisfarne's altar stones. The psychological impact spread across Christian Europe like wildfire. If Lindisfarne could be destroyed, no monastery was safe. If God wouldn't protect his most devoted servants, no prayer offered security. If the sea could bring death as easily as it brought trade goods, no coast was secure. Within a year, monasteries across Britain were relocating inland. Coastal communities were building watchtowers. Kings were organizing rapid response forces that might reach attack sites before raiders could escape. But the Vikings had achieved something more profound than a successful raid. They had announced the arrival of a new kind of warfare: combat, where mobility mattered more than numbers, where surprise trumped preparation, where the ability to project force across water gave decisive advantages over land-based enemies. The tactics that destroyed Lindisfarne would terrorize Europe for 3 centuries. The religious crisis, triggered by Lindisfarne's fall, echoed through Christian thought for generations. If God allowed his servants to be slaughtered at their prayers, what did that say about divine justice? If pagan weapons could triumph in the holiest places, what value did faith really possess? Some Christians saw the raids as divine punishment for their sins. Others questioned whether their God was strong enough to deserve worship. The theological earthquakes that began at Lindisfarne would shake Christianity for centuries. The survivors who escaped Lindisfarne carried more than traumatic memories. They carried the news that would transform European consciousness. Brother Oswald's account reached the court of Charlemagne within weeks. Irish monks, fleeing Viking attacks, spread warnings throughout their extensive network. Anglo-Saxon kings shared intelligence about the new threat facing Christian civilization. The psychological contagion of Viking terror spread faster than the raiders themselves. The economic implications were equally devastating. Monasteries represented the medieval world's banks, storing wealth accumulated over centuries. When Vikings proved they could raid these treasures with impunity, the entire system of medieval finance began to shift. Treasure moved inland. Coastal trade declined. The commercial networks that had enriched maritime communities for centuries began to unravel as merchants avoided waters where Viking ships might appear. The transformation that began at Lindisfarne would reshape the map of Europe. Islands that had been peaceful sanctuaries became targets for systematic plunder. Coastlines that had been highways for trade became invasion routes for raiders. Communities that had flourished by the sea abandoned their homes for inland safety. The geography of Christian Europe was being redrawn by Viking axes. Within a decade of Lindisfarne's destruction, similar raids had struck Ireland, Francia, and the Low Countries. Each attack refined Viking techniques. Each success encouraged more raiders to try their luck against Christian targets. What had begun as a single morning's violence on a holy island had metastasized into a continental crisis that would define medieval history. The 30 ships that had appeared through the mist on June 8, 793 AD, carried more than weapons and warriors. They carried the future. A future where no coastline was safe, no treasure secure, no prayer sufficient protection against northern fury. The age of Vikings had begun with the screams of dying monks, but it would continue with the sound of Christian Europe learning to fear the sea itself.